Welcome to this explainer. We love taking fascinating pieces of history and breaking them down so you can see exactly how all the pieces fit together. Today, we're diving into a captivating historical mystery nestled right in the heart of Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's the San Miguel Chapel. Now, it's famously billed as the oldest church in the United States. But, when you actually start digging into the historical records, the old maps, and the literal adobe mud holding this place together, you kind of have to ask, is that claim fact or fiction?
Okay, before we get too deep into the weeds, I want you to think about that old philosophical puzzle called the Ship of Theseus. The puzzle basically asks, if you have a wooden ship, and over time you replace every single rotting plank until literally none of the original wood remains, is it still the same ship? Keep that idea in the back of your mind, because it is the absolute perfect lens for understanding San Miguel. As we're going to see, history isn't always just a straight line. Often it's this incredibly messy story of erosion, destruction, and ultimately resilience. Section 1. The oldest church claim.
So to figure out if San Miguel actually holds the title, we've got to look at the competition. The whole oldest church title is actually a surprisingly fierce battlefield among historians. If you include all U.S. territories, the San Juan Bautista Cathedral down in Puerto Rico easily takes the crown, dating all the way back to 1521. But if we restrict things to just the continental United States, well, things get a bit muddy. St. Augustine Church at Islet Pueblo claims an origin of around 1609. San Miguel asserts it was built right around 1610. And then over on the East Coast, the Jamestown Church in Virginia was built in 1639. But here is the real trick. Adobe walls will literally melt in the rain if they aren't meticulously maintained, and wooden roofs burn. San Miguel's very first written record only dates to 1628. Because early records were slim to begin with, and so many were lost to time or conflict, historians are operating in a seriously gray area here.
Section 2. Barrio Beyond the River.
To truly grasp the history of this chapel, you really have to step outside its walls and understand the neighborhood that surrounded it. The chapel was built in a district called the Barrio de Analco. Now, Analco is a Nahuatl word. That's the language spoken by a lot of Central Mexican indigenous peoples, and it translates to on the other side or beyond the river. And this wasn't just some casual geographical description. It represented a massive, profound social boundary. A 1766 map by Joseph de Urrutia brilliantly illustrates this divide. On the north side of the Santa Fe River, you had all the Spanish elites and government officials living comfortably near the central plaza. But right across the water on the south side, in the Barrio de Analco, you had a completely different world. This was a working-class neighborhood initially settled by Tlaxcalan Indians. These were mercenaries, servants, and laborers who arrived all the way from Mexico in 1598 alongside the Spanish colonizer Don Juan Oñate. Interestingly, the Franciscan friars made it a top priority to build a church for these indigenous converts, even before the Spanish built their own main parish over by the plaza. Literally just steps away from the chapel, you'll find what's famously billed as the oldest house in New Mexico. Historical records trace the structure back to Juan de Leon Brito, a Tlaxcalan Indian resident of that very Analco district. It really anchors the fact that this neighborhood was deeply, deeply rooted in indigenous history and later Genízaro history. Genízaros were a community of mixed indigenous descent that essentially served as a physical buffer between the Spanish settlement and the surrounding Native American tribes.
Section 3. Destruction and Rebuilding.
Now, this neighborhood was absolutely not a peaceful oasis, and its violent, turbulent history is exactly what complicates that oldest status we were talking about earlier. The original adobe structure was erected right over an ancient kiva around 1610, but in 1640, this massive political feud erupted between the provincial governor, Luis de Rosas, and the Franciscan friars. The governor actually forced the Franciscans out of Santa Fe entirely, and during all this chaos, the chapel was partially or maybe even completely dismantled. Then, in 1680, after decades of brutal forced labor and religious conversion under the Spanish encomienda system, the Pueblo Indians launched a massive coordinated uprising. The Barrio de Analco took the immediate brunt of the fury. The neighborhood was destroyed, the San Miguel Chapel was burned, and the Spanish fled the area for 12 solid years before finally returning. So, when the Spanish eventually reoccupied New Mexico, they basically had to start from scratch. If you visit the chapel today and look up at the heavy wooden beams supporting the choir loft, you'll spot a carved inscription. It clearly tells us that in 1710, under the Marquis de la Peñuela, a man named Agustín Flores Vergara spearheaded the rebuilding effort. Local residents, which amazingly included a descendant of that Brito family we mentioned earlier, made thousands of adobe bricks totally by hand. Excavations done back in 1955 suggest the builders likely reused the original 1600s stone foundation, but the walls and the roof, those are strictly 18th century. And the wild ride didn't stop there. By the 1850s, an elaborate three-tiered bell tower was slapped onto the building. But then, in 1872, a violent storm ripped through Santa Fe and brought the entire tower crashing down. The church was very nearly demolished, but the community rallied yet again. By 1887, the Christian brothers, who had bought the property by that point, stabilized those leaning adobe walls by adding the heavy, European-style stone buttresses that you still see flanking the front doors today. Section 4. The Time-Traveling Bell. Okay, this brings us to one of my absolute favorite and highly entertaining mysteries held inside those buttressed walls. For decades, visitors would marvel at this massive, 780-pound San Jose bell sitting right inside the chapel. Stamped clearly into the copper was the date 1356. The legend surrounding this bell was incredibly romantic. The story went that Christian faithful over in Spain threw their gold and silver jewelry into the melting pot back in the 14th century, and that supposedly gave the bell its extraordinarily mellow, resonant tone. But here's the comedic twist. Back in 1914, a local historian decided to do some digging. He actually managed to find an elderly man who distinctly remembered the bell being poured and cast right there in Santa Fe. The real date wasn't 1356, it was 1856. Turns out, a simple, sloppy casting defect made the 8 look exactly like a 3. Plus, if you think about it, a genuine 14th century European bell would have used Roman numerals and Latin, definitely not Spanish. It's just such a great reminder that in history, a really good story sometimes covers up a much more mundane truth. Section 5. Treasures of the Chapel. Time-traveling bells aside, the actual verified artifacts inside this chapel are just staggering. When you walk to the front, you are immediately greeted by this incredible wooden reredos, or altar screen. It was crafted in 1798 by an anonymous artist known only as the Laguna Santero. It's got these beautiful, twisting Solomonic columns, and it houses a wooden statue of St. Michael that was carved down in Mexico around 1709. But what's really wild is what happened to it later on. In the late 1800s, this gorgeous masterpiece was completely slathered in 2 coats of generic house paint. Why? Well, some historians speculate it was a political move, an effort by pro-statehood locals to make New Mexico seem less backwards and less overly Catholic to the politicians back east. Others think it was probably just a really quick, cheap way to cover up decades of soot and candle wax. Whatever the reason, it wasn't carefully restored to its original glory until 1955. If you look along the sidewalls, you're going to spot these 2 mind-blowing indigenous artifacts that actually date back to the 1630s. One is an image of Christ painted on a buffalo hide, and the other is St. John the Baptist painted on deerskin. These are incredibly rare survivors. The Franciscan friars used these portable, visual aids to teach Christianity to the local Pueblo Indians. They perfectly, vividly capture that intense collision of Spanish religion and indigenous materials. And honestly, the collection just keeps going. Hanging on those thick adobe walls is a 15th century Byzantine icon, which is a copy of one held in Rome. There's also a vibrant 1745 painting of St. Michael crushing Satan, done by Bernardo Miera Yupacheco, who was a cartographer and one of New Mexico's very first noted artists. Add in 14 mid-20th century stations of the cross plaques, and you've got what is quite literally a museum of faith stacked upon itself. So, let's bring it all back to our main question. Is San Miguel really the oldest church in the United States? Well, we are right back to the ship of Theseus, aren't we? The kiva underneath is ancient. The foundation might just be from 1610. The walls are from 1710. And those sturdy buttresses are from 1887. But, maybe oldest isn't just a strict architectural measurement of mud and timber. Maybe the true age of San Miguel is found in the enduring legacy of the Barrio de Anaco itself, the Tlaxcalan Indians, the Franciscans, the Genízaros, and the generations of local residents who absolutely refuse to let it fall. If a building is burned, rebuilt, and modified over 400 years by the descendants of its original builders, doesn't its resilience make it something far more profound than just the oldest? That's a question I'll leave for you to decide. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning what you see.